Okay, there's a quick alertness quiz in this session. Which of the presenters are not like the others? I'm the girl. Thanks very much, Jonathan, Boaz, and Stevie. By the way, we all want a Stevie. So let's clone you. Yeah, no kidding, right? A round of applause for Stevie. It's a real pleasure to be back in Israel. I love coming here, as some of you may know, and it's a special privilege to be here and speak in the same orbit as my husband. You'll find that there is a diplomat in the Lute family. It is not Jane. So I warn you in advance. We've been talking about counterterrorism, and I really do echo what Doug said. This is the premier global conference on countering terrorism. And we learn a lot from it every single year, whether we are able to be present or not. But one of the things that I've noticed about the conversations in the United States, and this is a perspective from the United States, is that our conversations about terrorism are dominated by a national security point of view. I spent 32 years in the international and national security community, and when I got to Homeland Security, I thought I landed on Mars. Not for that reason. But it was an entirely different way of looking at the world. What do I mean? Very early on in our tenure at Homeland Security, the Secretary was having her morning intelligence brief. In fact, it was right after the episode of the underwear bomber, Abdul Muttalib, if you remember that, in 2009. And one of the interesting aspects of that episode was that Abdul Muttalib's father had gone into our embassy in Abuja, I think, and he had reported that he was very concerned that his son intended to harm the United States in some material way. And the secretary was incredulous. She said, how did that not, trigger more meaningful preventive action on our part? I said, oh, well, let's conduct an unscientific but nevertheless persuasive test of the difference between national security and homeland security. So I turned to our Karen Wagner, who was the head of our intelligence office, who had been a career intelligence officer her entire professional life. I said, Karen, you have a guy that walks in off the street and says, have I got a tip for you? What's your reaction? She said, oh, my God, you've either got a kook or a dangle on your hands. So you've either got somebody who's a little off, crazy, or somebody who's trying to entrap you. I turned to John Cohen and said, John, a career-long police officer. I said, you have somebody who walks in off the street and says to you, hey, officer, have I got a tip for you? What's your reaction? He said, it is our highest fidelity source of information in law enforcement. And that just gives you one window into the difference between taking a national security approach and a homeland security approach. I'm going to talk about some of the differences because they continue to astound me. And that if we persist in taking only a national security approach, again, this will not be unfamiliar to Israelis who have integrated these two approaches, certainly as long as I've been coming to Israel, and it's a long time, but not so much in the United States. I mean, we heard the mayor of Charlottesville talk before about how there was disintegration between the various institutions, not only of law enforcement at the state level, but also between the state level and the national level. I want to talk a little bit about those differences, and I want to tell you what I think those differences mean for fighting terrorism internationally, fighting terrorism domestically, and fighting terrorism in cyberspace, which is an altogether different cat. When you think about national security, at least when I do, it's strategic, it's centralized, it's top-driven. And when you think about homeland security, it is transactional, it's decentralized, it's bottom-driven. It's not hierarchical at all. It's driven from the bottom by the states, the communities, the towns, the cities in the United States. In national security, Washington is the national command authority. In homeland security, it's the federal partner to the states. It's not commanding anybody. The President of the United States cannot order the evacuation of Minot, North Dakota if the mayor says we're not going anywhere under most circumstances. Information in national security is shared on a need-to-know basis. In homeland security, there's a duty to share information. Why? Because the relationship between the public, government, and fear is different. In national security, the country has to be attacked before the nation goes to war. In homeland security, if you're the mayor of a small town and your citizens are upset or nervous because there's been a rash of thefts that seem not to be contained, you're fired. there's a very real difference between the public's relationship with their government under these two very different circumstances. In national security, certainly in the military, you don't question your superiors. By the way, it's a myth. Having served in the military, it's a myth, right? It's an important, that it's not really true, but the mythology is that you don't question up. In Homeland Security and law enforcement, you don't question the judgment of the frontline officer who's dealing with the problem in the moment. It's a very different culture of where you give the benefit of the doubt and where, and who has primacy of place. National security is deductive, Homeland Security is inductive. National security is about all of us. Homeland Security is about each of us. And so how does this play out in practice? I mean, national security will tell you a lot about the tone at the top. It will tell you nothing about the mood in the middle or the buzz at the bottom. Homeland Security deals, at least in the United States, deals with 5 to 7 million people every single day, and most of them are angry, I can tell you. Most of them are angry. 2 million people a day go through TSA checkpoints. 1 million people a day cross the borders of the United States. 90% of the American population lives within 1 hour of a major body of water, and they all love the Coast Guard. But Homeland Security has an exposure to the people of the United States in a way that the Department of Defense does not, the State Department does not, and our intelligence community should not. And so how does this really play out? Well, when you think about terrorism, at an international scale, and when you think about how do we understand the phenomena that we are dealing with. I remember having a number of colleagues from the Department of Defense wanted to come over and talk to us about the threat of nuclear proliferation. And they were going to school us on the importance of understanding transit zones around the world and high-value targets. I said, oh, come on over. We'd love to chat. So they all come on over, and they're talking about transit zones. And, I said, so fissile materials around the world, do we have a good handle on what's where? No. Okay. When you talk about transit zones, then how do we know where it's coming from and where it's going to? And they really wanted to talk about the vulnerability of certain geographies around the world. The Middle East is one of those geographies. The Stands, another of those geographies. Southwest Asia, another of those geographies. I said, oh, that's interesting. I said, we don't think of those places as transit zones. They said, well, what do you think is a transit zone? I said, Lufthansa, TWA, Maersk. Homeland Security has a very different point of view. They wanted to talk about high-value targets. In all cases, it was people. And for us, when we talk about high-value targets, they said, well, what do you think is a high-value target? I said, I don't know, the central bank, the payment system. So there's a real source of knowledge and information and approach to thinking about security that is very different in a homeland environment than it is in a national security environment. And I think very fundamentally, Homeland Security understands that governments have lost the corner on the market on the control of capital, the control of rulemaking, and the control of lethality. And that control of capital, lethality, and rulemaking has migrated into private hands. And Homeland Security, Interior Ministries, domestic security offices really understand that, and it seems to me like the national security community has not gotten the memo. I mean, for example, it is simply true that none of the major monotheistic traditions can control their fringes. And what does that tell us about the ability of secular institutions at a national level to get that job done without more help than they currently have? So Homeland Security frames questions very differently. When you think about the global problem of immigration, for example, by the way, no country is getting it particularly right. No country on the planet is getting it particularly right. When you look at immigration from a national security point of view, it's a development and a humanitarian problem. And from a Homeland Security point of view, I can tell you it's an economic and security problem for the populations that are receiving these immigrants. So when we're thinking about how do terrorist groups form, how do they grow, how do they operate, and why is it that ISIS seems to be was able to do something that no country on the planet could do? That is, attract young men from everywhere who would go anywhere because they feel like they belong nowhere. And tapping into that understanding of people is what's missing, I think, in our current approach when we overly emphasize a national security approach. What's your theory of the case? When it comes to national security, or when it comes to international terrorism, for example, I remember thinking this when I was at Homeland Security, asking, what's our theory of the case? Well, our theory of the case, all from 9/11 forward, was the bad guys are out there trying to come here. Okay, I get it. That seems pretty simple to understand. What are we going to do about it? Well, we need to find them and fix them in a military sense, keep them. Find them and fix them abroad. Keep them far away from us. Okay? What do we have to do that? Well, we have our considerable intelligence capability. We have our forward deployed military and military assets, and we have our allies, the British, the French, and others around the world, Israelis, etc. Okay. I remember sitting there asking the question, what if they're here already? What if they're already here? We need a new theory of the case. How well is our intelligence capability going to work here in the United States? By the way, it's not supposed to. How well is our military going to work deployed across the United States? By the way, it's not supposed to be deployed that way. And how are the Brits and the French going to help us out when we have a guy driving from Colorado to New York City to blow up Times Square? So we needed a very different theory of the case, and we needed to define it very, very differently, because in the case of the United States, as you all know, they are already present and operating, and we need a different orientation, a different way to frame the problem. Let me turn quickly to cyberspace and cybersecurity. This has captured everyone's imagination. It has completely changed the world. There's been a global cyber awakening where all of us are more informed, more connected, less protected, frankly, than ever before. And we're less protected, frankly, because we value connection over protection. We are excited and we're learning with an internet that is growing organically and instantaneously every day. And what has been the dominant approach or the impulse to deal with cybersecurity? It's to take a national security approach. Okay, can you think of three more useless words in the English language to describe the internet than strategic, centralized, and top-driven? Okay, personally, I cannot. All right, it is not the right way to think about security in cyberspace. We need, again, a different theory of the case, a different model for understanding. I think really there are only three interesting questions when it comes to cybersecurity. How do we architect systems we can trust from components we can't? Question number two, how do we safeguard the integrity of our information and our identity in an open exchange? One that has allowed us for the first time in our lives to deminiaturize ourselves. Oh, she's the Jew from New Jersey. Yeah, okay, that's true. But I'm also a lot of other things, and I get to tell people and act out on the other things that I am, right? But what's been happening online, we are reminiaturizing ourselves. We are reminiaturizing ourselves precisely with the tool that allowed us to deminiaturize ourselves, and we need to examine that. So question number one, how do we architect systems we can trust from components we can't? Question number two, how do we safeguard our identity and information in an open internet? And question number three, what should the role of government be? And governments everywhere are struggling with this role. How will we protect ourselves, our citizens in cyberspace? And I'm frankly just waiting for the first application of the Second Amendment protections to be used and deployed as a defense, because what we are seeing increasingly as the United States is people are shooting back in cyberspace, or people are going on the offense with cyber weapons, doxing people, using social media platforms, using hacks, using all of the techniques to cause mischief in cyberspace in an aggressive way. Governments are struggling with their role, and there are no clean answers. Look, I'll close with a thought, maybe bringing all of this, zooming back out again to the strategic level. There have been 4 strategic eras in my lifetime that have really defined how we deal internationally with foreign policy, with defense, with the major questions of global stability. Era number 1 was in the wake of World War II, when the big strategic question was, how do we prevent World War III? The second era was during the height of the Cold War, when superpower confrontation and the presence of nuclear weapons and a real Cold War meant the only thing standing between us and the precipice was our judgment. Strategic era number 3 was during the end, after the fall of the Berlin Wall through the 90s, and where everyone realized that the United States is that much more powerful than anyone else. And this big strategic question dominating the global dialogue was, what will the US do with its power? And in the wake of 9/11 and in the invasion of Iraq in the early 2000s, you got the answer to that. Whatever we want, whatever we think we need to do to keep ourselves safe. And since that moment, the big strategic question dominating not only the United States, but internationally, is how fragile is the American commitment to liberal democratic values? You are facing that same question here. How fragile is our collective commitment to liberal democratic values? None of the rest of these issues will matter if we get the answer to that question wrong. Thank you.